when I close my eyes and think about my earliest comic book experiences, like the real introductory level stuff is, closing my eyes and I'm in a supermarket, probably with my mom. Certainly it's the 90s, and the thing I always would keep my eyes peeled for was this one rotating tower, and it had all the comic books. Well, not all of them, but it had it had a selection that I think you would expect from a South Boston grocery store in the 90s. You had your Disney adventures, and I remember having some of the Nickelodeon stuff like Ren and Stimpy having their own comic book. But I remember being excited about the stuff I could find, like Batman. Like I remember Nightfall being a big one. Like the really intense covers of Ghost Rider and Punisher. And I remember X-Men probably being the most 90s comic book, probably 90s in general. I think even now when I look back and read some of the X-Men comics, especially that first issue with Jim Lee and Chris Claremont, it's like you open that up and like you can hear Pearl Jam and Spin Doctors and maybe even Bill Clinton. It's so 90s. It's fantastic. It's it's a little key to the past. But that's the thing that I remember the most. And the thing that kind of was always infuriating as a kid, because obviously it wasn't a guarantee your parents were going to buy you a comic book, but because I didn't have any comic book stores near me, I could never get a story issue to issue. So there was so many gaps, and I never knew what the hell was going on. And the thing I remember most, like kind of one of the big puzzlements, was Onslaught, this juiced up looking version of Magneto. Like just trying to, like he had the helmet and he was big and he was ripped, and I had no idea what was going on. And that is what today's episode is about. It's, as an adult, looking back and reading Onslaught for the first time in its completion. So that's what today's episode is all about. Kind of reconciling what I thought Onslaught was about versus what it actually is about, and kind of like, mid-30s realization versus, 10-year-old expectations of what the story would be. That being said, get comfy, grab something to drink, maybe a snack, because we're diving into the multiverse. Once again, everyone, welcome back to the Multiverse. I am your host, Paul, and thank you for joining me on this what I think is a special episode. Special for two reasons. One, I'm tackling a saga by myself. The others, they wish they could be here. It's just regrettably they were not invited. They're great people. I love them. They just have a tendency to kind of talk back at me, and this is going to be free-flowing thought of memory and research and opinion. So if you're not the biggest fan of me or my voice, this is not the episode for you. But it's going to be a little educational, mildly entertaining at best. So I'm just setting the expectations now, and we're gonna dive in. And where to begin with X-Men? As I've mentioned previously in other episodes, I took on this project of reading all of the X-Men books, like all of them, like starting back 1963. Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s. Here I am with Onslaught, and Onslaught is kind of like the big thing I really wanted to talk about, because I really had no idea what the hell the story was about. I just knew X-Men were involved, Avengers, Fantastic Four, the Hulk. if you're in a Marvel comic book, chances are you had a role in this book. And through my reading and research, I got to know why. So I think, if anything, it's probably a good idea just to kind of start somewhere in the beginning. And that is kind of even a tricky thing to do, because it's hard to do the Onslaught origin without talking about a bunch of stuff, because there's no... I think it might be arguable that there's a first issue of Onslaught, but it's a progression. And it's, again, it could be up for debate, but I'm going to just do the best I can with the research that I have, with the interpretation that I have, and also kind of diving into the backstory of how this thing kind of came into be. So, as I mentioned, we're in the 90s, and the 90s was a tough time, not just for comic books, but for Marvel in particular. Marvel didn't have the corporate backing that DC has, because Disney is funded by Warner Brothers. They got that studio backing. That's why, DC fans don't have to worry about, oh boy, I hope Warner Brothers can get the film rights back from Green Lantern so we can have a Justice League movie. That you guys don't have to worry about that. And honestly, I'm kind of jealous, because Marvel was on the verge of bankruptcy in the 90s, and to help keep themselves afloat, they sold a lot of their film rights. That's why Spider-Man is with Sony, and why, it's been kind of a crazy few weeks about what is going to happen with Spider-Man post Far From Home, the movie. And why it was such a big deal when Disney got that Fox deal, because in the 90s, X-Men, Fantastic Four, Daredevil, they got sold to Fox. So slowly, Marvel is getting all their film properties back from a decision that was just to help keep Marvel alive. And the comic book sales were hurting. Captain America, the Avengers, Fantastic Four. I mean, it's probably hard to imagine it now because you look at the movies, but once upon a time, those characters were not doing well, except one book, X-Men. X-Men was their best-selling comic book. I think that first issue of X-Men with the Jim Lee art and the Chris Claremont story, was huge. It sold millions of copies. I don't think even the guys at Marvel were expecting that. So they had to find a way to do a reboot, a soft reboot, because they didn't want to do a whole reboot because, again, X-Men, so good. Why fix what isn't broken? So Marvel wasn't coming at it like the way Crisis on Infinite Earths is, or, where it just wasn't like a hard reboot. Like this is now, the past doesn't matter. Marvel didn't do that. They did a soft reboot. And that came in the form of Onslaught. And then to go into Onslaught, there's, kind of a backstory with the characters. And it really comes down to the relationship between Professor Charles Xavier and Eric Magnus Lyncher. For those who don't know, Charles Xavier is a mutant, a strong telepath who had this strong desire to create a world where humans and mutants could coexist peacefully. And Charles Xavier comes from wealth, good family. And so he is very hopeful in mankind, very optimistic. And then you have Eric Lyncher, who is a Holocaust survivor who has endured the worst of man, seen the worst of man, and thinks that there's just no hope. There's no way that humanity can coexist with itself, with its differences. So, and at the time, again, 1963, this was allegorical to the civil rights movement. Charles Xavier was modeled after Martin Luther King, and Magneto was molded after Malcolm X, two individuals who wanted the same thing, just did very different ways to go about it. And part of the backstory, you have Charles Xavier and Magneto. Sorry, not Magneto yet. He's just Chuck and Eric, which sounds like that could have been a sitcom in the 90s, like two guys sharing a room trying to save the world. But, they were friends at the beginning. They had met like in a hospital, I think in Israel, if I'm not mistaken, where they would kind of sit down or go out to drink and just kind of share these thoughts about what was best for mutant kind and for humanity. Again, Chuck wanting to create a world where everyone could coexist. Eric thinks that mutant superiority over genetic majority. But they were respectfully disagreed, I think. But eventually, their paths went down two very different roads. Charles Xavier, while traveling the world, he kind of comes across his kind of first, what the comics would describe as an evil mutant, this guy, Amal Farouk, who, if you guys watch Legion, he's a villain in that show. And it's where Chuck comes across that there's another powerful mutant who, rather than wanting to make kind better, wants to abuse their gifts, wants to kind of rule over others. And it's kind of in that altercation that Chuck says, and I quote, "Then and there I found my life's work, to bring mankind and its mutant children together in peace and harmony, and to protect humanity from creatures like Farouk. I eventually came home and formed the X-Men. First the old team, and then the new. They became my family. I loved them all so much." Xavier meets this with compassion. Eric is like, fuck humanity, never again. So Eric becomes Magneto. He forms the Brotherhood. Chuck's got the X-Men. Again, same goals, very different ways about going about it. So, you cut to years and years later. There's a comic event called Fatal Attractions, which very 90s. It just kind of, you can't help but think of Sharon Stone, Fatal Attraction. I don't know, is Xavier sitting in his floating wheelchair, uncrossing his legs, trying to, I don't know where I'm going with that reference, but you get the idea. And basically what happens is Magneto is on Avalon, and he's got his asteroid, and he's finally just like, you know what? He just makes a tour with all the mutants, and he's like, come with me if you want to live. And he's getting super aggressive, taking out EMPs and shutting down power. And he's just scaring people. And Xavier's like, bro, this is hurting the cause, man. You're making us all look bad. We all can't be worked with. You gotta knock this shit out. And so, Xavier gets the X-Men together. They go into space. This is when, and this is a pretty badass moment. This is the moment where Magneto, in his ultimate kind of badassery moment, sucks out the adamantium from Wolverine. Wolverine, Hugh Jackman, just picture that if you're not familiar with the books. Body, his bones laced in metal. And of course, Magneto, having the power of magnetism, just pulls that out of Wolverine. It's intense. And that's kind of showing, where Magneto stands, where he's officially done. And because of that, Xavier's reaction is, well, I'm done too, and he shuts down Magneto's mind. He just, catatonic state, shuts him down. And this is basically the beginning of Onslaught. This is the kind of where, I guess, the germination kind of starts, where, because at least according to the comics, all of that, hatred that Magneto has, it didn't just disappear. It went into Charles. And Charles Xavier, who at that point was so frustrated with mankind, just doesn't understand why can't we all just get along? Why can't this work? And Xavier has had a series of I think what he would describe as failures, and then the type of failures that really would haunt him. You know, you have the legacy virus breaking out, and you know, they weren't able to save Ilyana Rasputin, you know, Colossus's sister, and everyone is being impacted by this virus. He tries to rehabilitate Wolverine, and it backfires magnificently, and you know, Sabretooth almost kills Psylocke, and Psylocke's in a coma fighting for her life, and yeah, so Xavier is just kind of really just so heartbroken by a series of these failures. And I think the worst of all, I think, was that there was a storyline where there was this character named Dennis Hogan, who was in the early stages of his mutant power manifesting, and he seeks out Xavier for sanctuary, and while trying to find that help, he's stalked by this kind of just this murderous group of people, just like mob mentality, where they recognize that he's different, they hunt him down, and Xavier senses this, and he's trying to get his X-Men together to save him. I think like Storm's carrying him, and you know, trying to fly him there, and they get there, it's too late. That this Dennis Hogan character is murdered, and Xavier experiences that person's fear, receiving that hatred, and how brutal his life leaves him, and it just rocks Xavier to his core. And then you have your Legion quest, which was another event in the 90s where Legion, again referencing the show, Xavier's son thinks that everything would be better if Magneto wasn't around. So Legion quest goes back in time, kind of like Terminator, where he goes back in time to assassinate Magneto before all of this evil Brotherhood shit happens. But Xavier, being who he is, he takes the fall for Eric. Eric holding Magneto, this person that he loved, who, you know, differed in opinion with, is having his life fade away. And so, to honor his friend and his sacrifice, Magneto now forms the X-Men, and that takes us into the other event, big Marvel event, X-Men event, the Age of Apocalypse, because now that Xavier's gone and Sabinur, Apocalypse rises up, and he kind of takes that opportunity to start taking over the world. And it's not pretty. It's post-apocalyptic 90s fashion. I mean, nobody looks good. Wolverine loses a hand. Cyclops has long hair. It's crazy. And out of that, you know, we get the character Nate Gray. Nate Gray is like the ultimate powerful, like, telepath, psychic. You know, he is, you know, so intensely powerful that like his power goes beyond like Xavier and Jean Grey. And he was created by Mr. Sinister. Mr. Sinister, who just really is a little too much of a fan of Jean Grey and Cyclops, to the point where he's taken their DNA and experimenting, and he creates Nate Gray with the intent of Nate Gray kills Apocalypse so then Mr. Sinister can take over and rule the world. You know, typical bad guy stuff, but Magneto beats him to it. He kills Apocalypse. Bishop is able to reset that timeline, so to speak, and Nate Gray is now kind of pulled from that world and into the main X-Men continuity. And speaking of Bishop, he's another time-displaced person, where he's in part of a world where the future also went to shit. And, you know, that it was the Sentinels rose up, and they not only went after mutants, but humans. And so there was this kind of a brief alliance at one point where the humans and mutants got together to take over the Sentinels, basically uneasy allies. And that's the world where Bishop comes from. And because of comics, Bishop goes back in time to present-day 90s. But he comes back with this knowledge that all of basically what creates Bishop's timeline is some traitor, this unknown traitor. And there's like video footage of Jean Grey talking like, "Oh my God, I can't believe it's you." It cuts out and nobody knows who she was talking to. And so that was sort of Bishop's motivation, that he was kind of like back in time to kind of solve that mystery that didn't get resolved anytime soon, which I get it. I mean, you don't want to play your hand too soon with revealing Bishop's game plan. And that finally gets, brought up in Onslaught. And so, yeah. So again, you can kind of see why there's not really like a point where Onslaught's like, "Hello, I'm here. I'm Onslaught. I'm here to be an antagonist." So it was kind of like the slow build, because basically now that we've kind of established Nate Gray, who is the X-Man, Bishop, the relationship between Charles Xavier and Magneto and their friendship rivalry, we kind of now can get into Onslaught, which is basically Magneto's frustrations and Xavier's frustrations. You make a cocktail, and that's how you get Onslaught. And Onslaught is, he's teased early on in the comics. Like, there's a point in time where the Sentinel factory is taken over. Like, scientists go missing, and all that anybody can find on the monitors is this word Onslaught. I think it's very ominous. Like, who is Onslaught? Very, very suspicious and intense, and like, who wants to take over the Sentinel factory? And so the earliest kind of memory I have, and kind of rereading Onslaught, and again, a lot of this I didn't know as a kid. How could I? Because again, it was gaps everywhere. So it was nice to kind of sit down and really just start to kind of read what in the hell is going on. And let me just see here. I'm referencing my notes. So the big thing, earliest thing I remember is, Beast and Bishop going to a movie, walk out of the theater, and the unstoppable Juggernaut crash lands in front of them, and he says that he's knocked out by somebody named Onslaught. And then the X-Men have noticed that there's this rising threat, and these differences in Charles. He's very moody, and is being more aggressive, and kind of keeps talking about how we need to have a new plan because our plan isn't working. We need to kind of get more aggressive with how all of this is going down with humanity, and to the point where X-Men are like, that's kind of intense, man. I don't know. I don't think that there's probably a need for us to act like that, and so that's sort of, but again, nobody knows that Xavier is Onslaught. The kind of one of the early cameos or images we have of Onslaught is actually he appears in front of Jean Grey, who is clothes shopping, which I don't know if that's the perfect time to be giving a pitch, but, Onslaught appears, and they kind of go on this telepathic magical mystery tour where, Onslaught is kind of giving her this pitch that, like, hey, Xavier's dream, it's kind of bogus. It's not going to work. And one of the things that he does, he presents this very, very, very early memory of Charles Xavier and his interactions with Jean Grey. When I say early, this is actually in like the very first X-Men issue where there is a thought balloon where Xavier says that he loves Jean but could never tell her. I'm not too sure why that is the piece of evidence that Onslaught presents that we can't trust him because he was in love with you once. Don't worry, he's moved on. He's gotten past it, but clearly not a guy you can trust. And so Jean's like, I mean, weird, but he's over it, and I still trust Charles. I still believe in the dream. I think it's worth fighting for. And Onslaught's like, all right, fine, whatever. You know what you're talking about. I'm going to move on. And he leaves the psychic brand on her forehead, and it just says Onslaught. Very intense. And so Onslaught, he starts to look into getting the powers of Nate Gray and Franklin Richards. Franklin Richards is he is the son of Sue and Reed Richards of the Fantastic Four, and he's a mutant. He's another, holy shit, can't believe the power level on this kid because he can rewrite reality. He's a mutant. And even the X-Men, when they come across, Xavier's files, they're like, why is he looking into Franklin Richards? And he's a mutant, so it's not like it's too suspicious. And so Onslaught, crafty as he is, he presents himself to Franklin as a little boy, and they become friends. And Onslaught is like the manifestation of like the imaginary friend. Like they play and go on adventures, and he, being Onslaught, is slowly trying to gain Franklin's trust. And so now his plan is to bring in Nate Gray, who is this powerful mutant telepath. So the goal is Nate Gray would basically kind of put everyone's consciousness together so that everyone could kind of be on the same page with Onslaught. And then Franklin would be used to rewrite the reality. Because basically, again, this Onslaught is, all of the frustration and the failures. And it's just like, if we're going to do this, if we're all going to get along, we're doing this, and we're doing this my way. And so, he finally reveals himself to the X-Men when he does like a big universal pitch, like what he had with Jean Grey about we need to get, serious, and we need to be more aggressive, and to the point where, we just need to take out our enemies. And the X-Men's like, whoa, hey, that's not what we stand for. And so Onslaught's like, okay, fine, whatever. You guys can go fly a kite. And Onslaught, presents himself in front of the X-Men. And from there, making moves against Nate Gray and Franklin, and he launches these Sentinels that, remember early on when, the scientists were kidnapped, and, basically he was having these guys mold and create Sentinels, and they go off, and they're not going after humans. They're basically just kind of going after humans, and they're trying to get them, scared, because Onslaught is going to feed off of that. He wants people to feel, anxious and moody, because he's going to feed off of that. So that's why the Sentinels were there. And it kind of gives everybody, and when I say everybody, I mean everybody in the Marvel Universe, a reason to get involved. Like you have Spider-Man, who, is taking out these Sentinels because he's trying to save people, and he's doing it with Peter Parker. And I know you're thinking like, wait, but Paul, Peter is Spider-Man. Right. Well, this is also post-Clone Saga, where Ben Reilly is Spider-Man, and Peter Parker is a guy who sometimes has his spider powers and will chip in once in a while. It's a whole thing. Clones. Not to mention, too, speaking of clones, you have Joseph here in the mix, and Joseph is like a clone of Magneto. He's basically Brad Pitt from Legends of the Fall, just long white hair, like, just trying to make him super sexy, and doesn't remember who he is, only that, well, I guess I was this guy named Magneto, and I was kind of a dickhead, but I'm going to make things right. So he's involved in all of this, too. God, clones, 90s. Ugh. So you can kind of see why they were going after the soft reboot. Yeah, so the Avengers get involved, and even Nate Gray goes to the Avengers being like, hey, man, Xavier is cuckoo for Cocoa Puffs. You got to get in on this. So the Avengers want to stop the Sentinel attack. The Fantastic Four want to get Franklin Richards back. So the Sentinels is kind of a nice way to pool everybody together. And then Onslaught, who I didn't know was kind of super into, what is the word that I am looking for? He was also apparently like a real estate agent on the side and wanted property in Central Park. And so he creates this kind of crazy tower, which I think is, again, used to, just terrify people, get them scared, because he needs that psychic energy. Because fear apparently works best of all. He's trying to make his presence known to stir up that anxiety, paranoia, hopelessness, fear, hysteria, because again, he's using all of that. And of course, the Sentinels, they're used just to kind of stop, kind of keep the heroes at bay. And I guess there were also, the Sentinels were kind of designed to cancel out any, like psychic energy from like the mutants. And that was all done from the kidnapped scientists. And basically, that cancel energy they would redirect from the terrified masses, and they were going to direct it at Onslaught. So that was his game plan. And I guess one of the reasons why he has this tower set up in Central Park is because there is apparently a lot of like tunnels. If you're a Dark Tower fan, they would be called thinnies, where they're just sort of like portals that could kind of get you from one spot of the Earth to another. And that's what he would use. Because at one point in the X-Men books, Xavier learns about Landau, Luckman, and Lake. They're a holding company. X-Men issue 332. And they're used for kind of pan-dimensional portals, and he uses that to spread his power. And one of the reasons why the tower is in Central Park is because below Central Park is like a pretty powerful, pan-dimensional portal, which so happens to be over the Grand Chamber of the Morlock tunnels. Those are the mutants that, they were just, they couldn't even pretend to function in society. So, they're all underground. And so, so that's why he's got that thing in Central Park going. I didn't really kind of catch that when reading the comics. This was sort of after, kind of doing the research and understanding, oh, okay, that's why he's kind of doing this big dramatic power thing. And so everyone's coming into Central Park to try to fight, and at one point they're able to save Xavier, and Xavier is pissed because he's like, you guys are idiots. I was the one thing keeping Onslaught at bay, and now that you've taken me out of him, there's really nothing stopping him from using like Nate Gray or Franklin. And so, where the odds are even more stacked against us. So, and Onslaught says, well, I let you get this close. You could get Xavier, kind of confirming the plan there. So, let's see here. There's actually a really interesting point in the book, too, where the Watcher shows up. And it's bad when the Watcher's there. You just pretty much know that, like, big shit's about to go down when you have the Watcher there. And the Watcher is hanging out with, like, Apocalypse, which I didn't know they were, like, drinking buddies. So they're just sitting there watching, which is what the Watcher does. And so, the Watcher says, hey, I really shouldn't get involved. Not really my thing. But you probably want to think about getting involved, And Onslaught is like, I'm sorry, not Onslaught, excuse me, Apocalypse is like, no, this is, like, sort of what I'm about, survival of the fittest. I want to see who's going to win out. And the Watcher's like, true, but if Onslaught wins, you're gonna be dead, and then nobody's gonna rule anything. And so Apocalypse is like, okay, fair point, I hear you, let me get involved. And this is kind of cool, because then you have all of the villains getting involved. You get like Doctor Doom getting involved and Apocalypse. And so at one point, Cable, who another time displaced traveler, who's like the son of Scott Summers and Madeline Pryor. Oh, also a clone, but that's another episode for another podcast. And Cable comes from the timeline where, you know, Apocalypse was ruling, and his kind of whole purpose is to kill Apocalypse. So, you know, naturally, when you're trying to brainstorm with, you know, stopping, you know, a big super villain like Onslaught, when Apocalypse appears, Cable's like, nah, fuck you, you gotta die. And so they start fighting. Sue Storm is like, yo, can we save my son and the world first before you guys just kind of go into this huge cataclysmic fight? And so they're like, all right, fair point. So they devise a plan where Cable and Apocalypse are going to go sneak inside Onslaught to get Franklin. And Franklin is still obviously alive because Onslaught can't use Franklin Richards' power. He kind of has to convince Franklin to use it. And it's a pretty clever writing device, so it kind of buys some time. And so when, you know, and they're a little hesitant about trusting Apocalypse, because when you know someone whose name is Apocalypse looking the way that he does, naturally you're not going to be full of trust. But what choice do you have at that point? And of course, Apocalypse shows his hand, and he's like, oh, we gotta kill Franklin Richards. And Sue Storm was invisible the whole time, and she was like, you jerk, I fucking knew it. And so they pull him out, and, you know, they're just like, all right, well, obviously that's not gonna work. We're gonna have to regroup again. You know, think of something else. So let's see here. I'm just kind of going through my notes again. Oh, and then Jean Grey has this idea of unleashing the Hulk. Because the Hulk, at one point, he launches his own plan to go after Onslaught, and Onslaught just kind of fucks with him on a mental level, where he's kind of just failing over and over and over, and kind of showing the Hulk how everyone, you know, doesn't trust him. And Jean Grey has this idea of, hey, why don't I just eliminate the Bruce Banner side of things and just let Hulk be Hulk and go after Onslaught? Again, you know, I wouldn't have gone with that, but, you know, you're running out of options from a pretty powerful nemesis who is, you know, kind of like, he's the worst of both the, like, you know, the best part of the X-Men and like the worst part of your nemesis. So yeah, they unleash Hulk, and I think he cracks Onslaught's armor. Cracks. Like, as in, not that devastating of a blow, but everyone cheers like, oh my god, you guys, we can hurt him. And then Thor jumps in, and, you know, with Mjolnir, and have at thee. And they all watch Thor do it, and they're like, well, all right. That seems like a good game plan. They all charge in, and the X-Men's going to join in, which only makes sense. I mean, it's pretty much an X-Men event. But, you know, I think it's Reed Richards who's like, no, you can't jump in, because if Onslaught gets a hold of any of your mutant powers, then we are SOL. And this is where the writers were, again, trying to do this soft reboot, where they wanted to reboot everybody but the X-Men, because the X-Men were doing so well. So, Fantastic Four, Avengers, you know, Spider-Man, or, you know, just, it's everybody. Everybody's jumping in to get involved so they can have a soft reboot, which basically kind of goes into Heroes Reborn. So they all dive in. Onslaught is defeated, disappears into a puff of smoke. And all that's really left are the X-Men. And you have Franklin Richards, who's, like, you know, carrying this blue ball, and it's basically the dimension or universe that he's created for the new heroes, the Heroes Reborn, which goes into Heroes Returns. It's almost kind of like the end of, what was it St. Elmo's Fire? Where, like, the last scene is like they were all just characters made up by a boy staring into a fucking snow globe. That's pretty much what this was. Except everything you did see did happen. He's just walking around with this little blue ball with all of these heroes in it. Because that's what he does, and that is essentially the story of Onslaught. Yeah, it's weird. And I don't know, I think if I had read it when I was a kid, I would have really liked it. And that's not to say I didn't like this, because I did, for all of its 90s glory. But yeah, it was just really weird. But I do like that Onslaught was sort of like a culmination of consequences. Like, you have the consequences of this friendship between Charles and Magneto, the consequences of Fatal Attractions and Legion Quest and the Age of Apocalypse. I like when stories just kind of build. There's no riding into the sunset. I'm the type of who always wants to see, yeah, but then what happens after the sunset, like that night, the next day, and that's what this is. So that's something that I did appreciate, that there was just this domino effect, that everything was happening because of this other decision that was made. Learning, I think, a bit more about Onslaught. Like, I had known that it was like a culmination of Xavier and Magneto. I just didn't know the specifics, so that was kind of interesting. And that reveal of that Charles Xavier is Onslaught, because even though, as I was saying, it was like a melding of Xavier and Magneto, it's really Charles Xavier, because, at this point, Magneto is just in a catatonic state, so it's Charles Xavier kind of carrying Onslaught and letting it grow and feed inside him, to the point where it's bubbles up and gets unleashed on the world. So that was kind of interesting, and it was, almost kind of, sad in a way, because, especially when you see Xavier kind of having to go into custody, because it's like, it's tricky, because it was him, but it wasn't, especially when Onslaught manifests and is its own thing outside of Xavier. And I'm not always big on writing heroes to become villains, like what would happen later on with Cyclops when he, comes into contact with the Phoenix Force, and he kind of becomes this militant monster and kills Charles Xavier. I don't know. It's, it's, to quote Harvey Dent, you either die a hero or you live long enough to see yourself become the villain. And I'm just not wild about, like, when they get in contact with a superpower, because then it's not like you're fully diving into this person now being a villain. It's like, oh, well, it's only because of Onslaught, or it's only because of the Phoenix, and not, this person getting... I mean, yeah, it is getting perverted by power, but I feel like it's also kind of like a cop-out. So that was kind of my only kind of, like, I think, like, kind of negative point. I mean, otherwise, I love the artwork. Though there are some weird bits, like when Magneto took out the adamantium for Wolverine becomes, like, feral, and apparently his nose drops off. Like, I didn't understand why he just starts looking like a jacked up Voldemort. Like, what the hell happened to your nose? There wasn't any adamantium in your nose. It's all cartilage, so... What? I get trying to look bestial, but it was weird. But, the Kubert art is pretty great, and I am always a sucker for seeing Fantastic Four and Avengers and X-Men having, like, a super-duper team-up. And I think what also kind of kills the Onslaught story for me a little bit is... not Fantastic Four, but the kind of Heroes Reborn thing. I was cool with the Captain America stuff, because he's pretty much the same, but like Tony Stark's a kid, or like, so that was weird. And all the Rob Liefeld art, it's pouches. I think really Onslaught is just a giant pouch whose motivation was to live in a world where heroes had more fucking pouches. It's crazy and disproportionate bodies. So, yeah, you look at the Rob Liefeld Captain America stuff, Heroes Reborn. Oh, woof. Actually, anything like the Iron Man armor, Thor. Oh, it's so 90s. I don't think that was the right direction to go in. I mean, again, I get having to do a soft reboot. And that was kind of the interesting thing, too, is that, again, not like DC, where now the past it doesn't matter, only moving forward. You could still acknowledge all these other stories. They still carried weight. They still mattered. It wasn't with this crap like Spider-Man One More Day, where we lost decades of continuity by absolving the Mary Jane Peter Parker marriage. So I do like how that was handled, where it wasn't like everything that you read and put your money into, it still meant something. It still had value to the overall books and continuity that you were reading. So yeah, Onslaught, I don't think it's the greatest X-Men thing. I would have loved it as a kid. I think it's still good. Do not get me wrong. Onslaught is something that I think I will read again. And come on, I have an Onslaught action figure, so there's a special space in my heart and kind of childhood nostalgia for. But maybe part of the reason why I don't like it is because now there's the mystery is gone. I think I finally know, and I think maybe that the story I had in my head just so very different than what I read. And I think that's sort of the fun of every mystery, is the not knowing and the wondering. And now that I've read it, I can't really imagine it the way that I used to. But I guess there'll always be a version of Onslaught in my head, which makes it sound like I would snap and have world domination. But, I don't plan on doing that anytime soon. But I really appreciate all of you for tuning in and listening. I hope you found it interesting. I hope I didn't bore you too much. If anything, gave you a little history lesson. I read a comic book that you don't have to, kind of gave you all the big important stuff. But if you do want to read Onslaught, it's available in all fine book and comic book shops, and it's also online, Comixology, Marvel Unlimited. So it's out there, so definitely check it out if you feel so inclined. And of course, with our marvelous podcast, definitely give us some love on iTunes. And please check out, www.graphicmultiverse.com. Check it out. Instagram, Twitter, Facebook. You all know the drill. Yeah, that's our show. Thank you so much again for subscribing and listening. And as always, enjoy your issues and keep exploring the multiverse.